Good morning, everyone. And I'm coming to you from the Boston area. I wish I was there in Orlando with you guys in person, but happy to be presenting remotely. So as you can see here from my title slide, I'll be presenting on barcodes and blockchain and how both of them can be used to leverage a more optimal supply chain. Let me just click there. So, I think everyone is probably more than aware, more than plugged into, the landscape when it comes to clinical trials, right? We've seen a boom in the number of, biotechs and pharma companies that have increased over the past few years, and a corresponding amount of clinical trials. Especially in the past couple of years, we know how complicated and complex the system is looking with respect to the entire system and specifically supply chain. There are so many different trial designs and they're not getting any easier. Direct to patient has been a focus for the past few years, and especially during the pandemic. We're also seeing an increased focus on decentralized trials. So in a nutshell, I think we're all aware of the complexities that we have, and certainly that is felt very strongly in the supply chain world. As these complexities increase in terms of, the trial designs and things like that, so do your systems, right? You're going to have, all these different portals and different ways of accessing data, inputting data, for all the stakeholders, whether it's the patient, the clinical site, the sponsor, all the sponsor partners such as the CMOs. Everyone has access to the data, but how they access it is a huge gap. It's a huge pain point and something needs to be done about it. And so I think one of the solutions that's out there that to me is of real interest is how we can really leverage blockchain. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. If you're new to blockchain and wondering what it is, I'm sure we've all heard of it. We've all heard of it certainly in more the popularized context of Bitcoin, but foundationally the technology for blockchain is one that's built on something of a very secure, robust platform. And when you're talking about these terms that are used, tamper-proof, timestamp, near real time, etc., these are things that should resonate with us as being important, to what we want in a system. And if you have an opportunity to, bring that forward, bring forth that visibility and bring forth that value to all your different stakeholders, well, that's certainly a technology that I am going to be interested in. And so when I first started to learn, more about blockchain, it's not, I'm not trying to be, one of these people that say, blockchain or bust, right? To me, it presents an opportunity and a solution that I think is really interesting, and one that I think, we as an industry should be looking at a lot more. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to make lives better for the trial participants that enroll into these trials. We're also trying to make it easier for the pharmacies, the PIs, the study coordinators that have a huge part in helping us, to identify the patients, work with the patients, etc. So, when we think about it in terms of that, that angle and that perspective, it's really important that we try to identify tools that's going to make it easier to bring about that data in a very transparent way. And so that's where I find value out of the blockchain, concept, and where, we can really leverage technology in a more meaningful way. Similar to that, is, barcodes, right? So we're all, again, probably very much in sync and aware of the problem that we have in today's world with barcodes. And what I mean by that is that, everyone has, some type of solution with barcoding. There's no standardization across, the industry, not yet in the clinical space, when it comes to barcodes. And what that does is that, if it presents a burden to the site, right? And so what I mean by that is, let's say we introduce some barcodes at Biogen, and then another company introduces a set of barcodes, on their product. The chances are, in today's age, that the set of standards and the set of data that's behind those barcode is probably going to be different from sponsor to sponsor. And so what that could also mean, as far as the site burden goes, is that we're now looking at a situation where sites have, kind of hundreds of barcode scanners for each sponsor, depending on, where it's coming from. And so that creates a lot of additional, sort of unnecessary burden on the site from a system engagement perspective. And I think that's where we really need to come together on identifying a standard that can be leveraged. With barcoding, there are a lot of benefits to it. So it's just sort of seamless in terms of, certainly from an inventory management perspective, what you want to send to a site, how you track it, what the site is able to ultimately confirm that, yep, this is the product that Biogen sent me from this warehouse, and now I'm handing it over to this patient. You want that to be done in a secure way, just from, whether it's a supply chain security perspective, whether it's certainly, getting the right treatment to the right patient perspective. There are a lot of drivers as to, why barcodes in particular, contribute to and offer a really good solution to making sure that end-to-end visibility is robust. And so again, I think the industry, and not to say that we haven't taken steps, but I think we really need to, look at the GS1 standards, which are used, practically in every other industry out there, even on the commercial side of what we do in life sciences and pharma. It's already being rolled out there as a requirement. So now that needs to translate into the clinical environment. One, it ensures consistency between the clinical and commercial worlds, and two, bringing about that standardization and barcoding will reduce that burden to the site. So there are initiatives taking place, with bringing about GS1 standards into clinical. Some companies are taking those initial steps towards adopting that. So I think that that's something we need to all sort of rally behind and really get our, feet wet with exploring that. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of the connection of, barcodes offering that, that point-to-point clarity of where your supply is, and why if it's built on a blockchain platform, it can add some value. So I'm going to speak a little bit here about the clinical supply blockchain working group. This was started back in 2017. Actually, Pfizer had sort of invited a lot of people to their Cambridge campus to talk about blockchain in general. What is it and how can it be leveraged? And from that, sort of effort, one of the topmost things that came about was that, clearly there is a space for blockchain in supply chain. And this was, this wasn't just a group of, supply chain enthusiasts in the room. This was a group of, over 70 participants, ranging from pharma, biotech to CROs, to software companies, academic sites, etc. In partnership with one of my colleagues at Pfizer, Chad Sklodowski, we kind of brought forward this working group and expanded it to other people in the industry, other sponsors, CRO, CMOs. You can kind of see at the bottom of the screen here a list of the participants. And we started to really ask ourselves, okay, what are we going to do? We created this charter about, let's envision an Amazon-like experience where we can really, customize the solution to the individual, to the patient, and give that, again, that Amazon-like experience. And maybe your experiences these days with Amazon is a little bit different just because of the supply chain issues, but I think you get my point. So as we developed that charter, we had the fortune of having UCLA involved there to kind of present it from the site perspective. And one of the things that they really brought to our attention is they kind of said, look, what we struggle with is just understanding what is coming to us on a given day, and from which sponsor, when is it coming? So it was kind of focusing on that last mile of, after manufacturing and, pack label, distribute, really at the point of distribution, getting clarity for the site as to what was coming in and from who. And so to us, we kind of like, well, that's great. That is a perfect example of how blockchain could be, very useful, where we're all contributing to, the blockchain platform. So, your Pfizers, your GSKs, Mercks, et cetera, can all send data to one platform, which is the KitChain platform. And, you can then see that information. And obviously there were certain permissions in place. So it's not to say that I could see Pfizer data or GSK data, but the important thing was that UCLA was able to see all that data from the sponsors that, that they partner up with. And so that's really where the value came. And we created this KitChain proof of concept that is focusing on this app that's able to scan, product when it arrives at the site, and you're able to get that verification also when dispensing it to the patients. So, let's talk a little bit about, kind of the data and how that plays into it. This is just an example. There's probably different iterations just depending on your organization and how you, how you manage it. But the black arrows here kind of signify the actual product that's being physically shipped. And all the green arrows just kind of indicate, where data is coming, coming and going. And really, this is a snapshot. I remember when we put this together, I looked at this 100 different times. And I'm like, well, there's also, scenario A and scenario B where, the green line goes all over the place. It just became a mess. It became this complicated web. And so again, it's not reflective of every clinical trial scenario. But I think the important thing here is that we know that there are a lot of different ways that data gets communicated. Some of this data may not even be well integrated to other systems. And so again, it sort of builds that, that use case of saying, okay, well, what can we do to bring it all together? So hopefully, again, that resonates. What I want to talk about is a partnership that we had at Biogen with IQVIA and Ledger Domain to really take this chain proof of concept and use it in an actual trial. So at Biogen, we identified a phase 1 healthy volunteer study that had 2 sites. These 2 sites, we sent basically 160 kits to each of the 2 sites there. And what we did is, we used the KitChain app to actually scan them in, scan all the product to verify that, okay, it's all been received. This is the product that it was indeed set by Biogen. And we did all this in parallel of the study. So for us, we were just trying to prove that, okay, is this a viable solution? What was really important is that, I think oftentimes, certainly I can speak from my perspective, being on the sponsor side, oftentimes you get tunnel vision and you come up with this, great idea or this great solution. You're like, yes, this absolutely is going to work. It's perfect. And you build a lot of momentum. What we sometimes forget is, okay, well, that engagement with the site, do they actually think this is a great idea? And so I think that was one of the greatest, sort of benefits and the best engagement that we got, where the pharmacists were super engaged in this entire pilot. They gave direct feedback about, how this would be worthwhile to them. And that for us kind of cemented that, okay, this is something that we need to continue to look into. So I'm going to get into, this is sort of a visual, the next couple of slides here of how the app looks like. We'll actually get into a little bit more of that in an audio clip here, kind of walking you through some of the things that we did. These were just the 2 sites that participated, where they were located. And this is the actual kit and the inventory that we sent to the sites. So you can see the kit number there. What follows next is a little bit of a video kind of walking you through some of the next steps and some of the, how we visualized, this data as well too. So let me go ahead and get you guys there.
Let's watch together as the 160 kits at each site are scanned in a batch quickly, with the app showing how we can track kits that are administered or flagged as possibly being out of spec. Meanwhile, all this data gets fed into the leadership dashboard in real time. As you can see, the study has its own dashboard summarizing the study status, shipment status, verification status, overall inventory picture, and any kits needing review. Here's how we envision the app working seamlessly by leveraging standardized barcodes, which can serve as a foundational building block for tracking kits, reducing site burden, and eliminating errors. Right now, you're seeing the Miami and Anaheim apps simultaneously feeding the dashboard side by side in real time.
So you can see this is pretty exciting, right? To kind of get this level of information. You can see how both, the use of barcodes is directly feeding into the blockchain platform, and how we're able to see that information real time. This view that you're seeing is very much geared towards, the sponsor, where we're able to see that information at sort of a dashboard level, with a lot of really important information right here at our fingertips. I know that a lot of this information exists in other systems, IRT systems, our CMO systems. But again, that kind of goes back to some of my initial points about, well, what is really the best system to look at? And so this is where I get excited about, seeing things kind of, come together in a very smooth and transparent way. There's another kind of screenshot here that shows you a little behind the scenes in terms of, additional functionality, where this can translate into, the actual trial participant dispensation of the drug. So you could see here that there's controls that are allowed about, okay, well, only these kits are available for dispensation. Again, because of, how we piloted this was very much, looking at that crawl, walk, run kind of approach, where we wanted to just introduce the application, see if there was interest, see if we could get the touch points in there, the information into the system, and work from there. What we're going to work towards next is really doing that, machine to machine integration and really get this platform up and running, eventually across our, portfolio. So that's it from the presentation. Hopefully we're okay on time, and I'm left a little bit of time for Q&A.
I'm coming.
Imran, Craig Mooney here. You knew I was going to be the first to ask. You look great, by the way.
Thanks, Greg. Good to hear
So a
you.
couple of things that initially came to my mind. And, one of my first things I say all the time is everyone wants to be the first to be second. So I'm glad that you're on this journey. When it comes to systems about sharing the data, I think that's probably one of the things that's going to be most important because of, you talk about the site duplicate transactions, like, all right, now I did this on this app and now I got to go log the shipment in the IRT system. I'd like to hear a little bit about that, but also what about like bring your own device? A lot of these, organizations or institutions, the pharmacies are locked down. It's hard to, I worked at an organization where we sent actual hand scanners. I'm like, are we really going to get in the logistics of sending scanners to sites? And what do you see about those as being the big challenges and how you think we might overcome those?
Yeah, it's a great question, Craig. I mean, it's also a very loaded question because, it's interesting. I mean, we've been trying to work on this kit chain concept for a while, and I think every time we present it, people get excited once they understand, what it's going to be. But, we run into these challenges that are very real about like, okay, well, there's system X or process Y and, this, that, or the other that make it really difficult. But I don't let that, kind of detract in terms of, what the goal that we're trying to strive towards. And I think that's why we're like, okay, well, on our approach for this, we wanted to do it in very practical manners. So it would have been great if we said, let's get IRT data in here, let's get CMO data in here. We know that there's that ability to integrate, with those systems and those vendors in particular. But how that's done and what the right system is for controlling or seeing that, I think are questions that are still out there. I think this gives us a good alternate or a good consideration for how that could look like. So and just to kind of add on to your questions, and I certainly don't have all the answers here, but the ecosystem is going to get a lot more complicated when you think about DCT in particular. DCT, I think, is a great concept, and certainly direct to patient being a component of that. I think that's the direction we need to go into. But now you're talking about introducing, central pharmacies. You're talking about like, how is that release? Like, how do we oversee that release? There's going to be actually, I feel like, a lot of burden that's going to be placed on sites because they have to coordinate, not only receiving the medication, but now, in cases where patients are at home, they're often the center point of coordinating, the patient and when delivery is going to be there. So to me, when I take a step back, I was having a conversation with some of, Craig, you'd recognize some of our colleagues from your prior position where we talked about this. And, that's where I kind of chimed in and said, look, a solution like kit chain is needed, for these type of complex environments that we're navigating, because how are we going to be able to see all this information and in which system? If we don't bring it somewhere into some type of centralized platform, I think we're going to have a lot more issues the more and more complex or larger our ecosystem gets. So sorry, Craig, I don't know if I if I
No,
just
you did. And I
ramble.
thought it was awesome, by the way. I think it's really awesome. And you're right. If you waited for every objection to be solved, you would never get anywhere. So I think it's a great approach. I think it looks awesome. And great. Thanks for taking the question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Greg.
Imran, we've got a question from the remote audience that I'll go ahead and read to you. And this will be the last question for time-wise, but you can go back to the chat box and continue the discussion. Question is from Brenda Yannick. Were you able to link the specimen tubes within the kits so that you could track specimens real-time via blockchain? Or was it at kit level only, not the kit contents?
Yeah, that's a great question. For this was really our first practical, entry point into this world. So no, it was really at the kit level. But that's a great question. And I think that's something that we, talk about as a team, as sort of a kit chain team all the time is, that right level, this kind of goes back, this question feeds into overall IMP accountability. And how specific do we get, and there's other components to it, like, destruction and returns and things like that. All of that is certainly on the, horizon for some of the goals that we have. But for this specific pilot that we ran, we didn't get to that level. But hopefully soon. Hopefully I'll be back here next year and the year after, kind of, with the kit chain team expanding on how we've developed this.
So as Ben mentioned, we wanted to talk a little bit more, expanding on what Imran had been talking about, on where we've really gone with this. We'll talk a little bit about the app itself. We'll talk more about the interaction of the different parties and where each one of the folks draws value. And one thing I want to mention before we even really get into it is a good part of what we identified even very early on when Pfizer and Biogen, we and Almec and others were sitting around the table, was it became very clear that everyone needed to be treated as a peer in this environment. And the advantage of treating everyone as a peer was there's a lot more interaction between them. Everybody has the opportunity to contribute. Everybody can draw information out of the system. And everyone can get a unique view that's specific to their role in that system. As we go through this, I'll talk a lot more about that, but that was one of the unique advantages that blockchain brought to the solution. So as I go through this, you may never hear me say blockchain again. And the reason for that is it's almost a bit of a distraction. It's a capability that we're able to bring forward, but in the end, it's not about the technology, it's about the peering capability, it's about the unique ability of each individual to see what they need to see. It's not about the technology itself. It is only because it's unique that brought us to this point. But the truth is, there are a couple of other ways that we could have done this. Blockchain just was the most effective way to bring us forward. So you've seen this a little bit before, but I'm going to come back to some of the basic capabilities. First and foremost, product tracking. Everything that we were focused around early on was about track and trace. There are other value propositions that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but it's where all of the most important information comes from. As we start to get an understanding of, okay, so product tracking is where we get the majority of the information that we'll share, and it's also one of the primary functions of the application. But in truth, the fact that we have real-time product data is what allows us to get other folks to participate as a part of this. Immutable records are an important part of it as well. We have very strong belief and knowledge of where things are at any given point in time. It can't be changed. Again, a part of the advantage of the technologies that we've used. So it can be trusted. In some cases, it's directly integrated with other systems, IRT and so on. In some cases, it's directly connected to a user. Through the app, through a website, whatever it may be, we have a number of different phases in which that can be presented. The focus early on had been around reducing site burden and increasing value of information. That's really where we were most focused. We'll talk about a lot of different use cases associated with it. We'll talk about different sources of value. But when you come down to it, it's those two things. One, the reduced site burden, and two, I'll focus on better quality information presented. And again, the collaborative model, this idea of peering between partners. And Mike, please add anything you like. So we talked about typical integration points, and we talked about the fact that sometimes this will be directly connected to a user, but sometimes it'll be to a system. One of the early bits of feedback we got from Almec, for instance, was they never wanted to see an app, ever. Everything needed to be integrated into their existing systems, which is, from our perspective, better as well, because we get true information as soon as it's available. And we give them true information as soon as it's available. One of the things that we've seen in the past is there's a lag of information for a number of different things. As an example, today when sites are required to use IRT systems, generally those sites are training an individual, maybe two, in those systems. And they're actually logging into those systems maybe once a day, maybe every couple of days. When we have these real-time connections, as they scan a product in at the loading dock, we immediately get that information. So all this moves much more quickly. And just as importantly, we feed that back to the IRT as soon as we receive it. Same is true for ERP systems, same is true for logistics and site inventory systems. If a site decides they want to build a real-time integration with us, we can. Otherwise, we're actually giving them a fairly light site inventory. So either way, they're getting some value out of that system. And I won't go into all of the rest of the other integration points, but we have a lot that we can do, but absolutely zero we have to do. In these early pilots, as an example, Savota will be doing one of the early pilots that we're doing with Biogen. They'll have two screens, one for their IRT system, one for kit chain, and they'll enter information in both places. As we mature, that'll become an automated interface. But this is what allows us to move through the pilots relatively quickly without having a lot of technology debt that we build into it.
Why don't we go to the next slide, Greg, and just talk a little bit about the value proposition, the business value, the technology value, and the financial value. And I think what we really saw during the kit chain demo and use with Biogen, and I was at the Miami site, Ben was at the Anaheim site, and when we first did this receipt, we were actually just manually coding it into our iPhone and into the application. It took us about 30 minutes to receive all of the product. We then used the barcodes and scanned it, and it took us about 3 minutes or less to do the scan of the materials into the system. And so, if you think about site burden and from receipt to reporting to auditing, the goal here is to reduce the amount of time that the pharmacist has to spend receiving the inventory. There's value in the technology that's being used, but from a financial perspective, all of the parties are getting the same information in a real-time fashion so that they understand inventory movements, when you're doing reconciliations, when you're taking the dispensing the product, we can flag it as well in the application. And so just trying to ease the burden of the site, particularly, and Ben, maybe you want to speak just briefly to the study at the UCLA and the experience there in terms of the number of sites and the number of products that were going through the demo at that time.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work with UCLA Health Pharmacy, and on their investigational side, there are over 700 clinical studies that they're trying to run that typically they're shut down completely to new studies. And so again, the goal that we raised was to try to get everybody on the same portal over time, gradually move people to the folks where they're getting an advance ship notification the day in advance of every new shipment, and then getting people to the point where they can really get it into the refrigerator and limit the damage from the get-go.
Yeah. I think it's important to say too, we'll talk and we'll continue to talk about the value that this is presenting to each of the parties that's interacting with the system, whether it be the sponsor, CMO, CRO, sites. The patient figures into this as well. In one case, one use case we'll talk about where it's direct-to-patient shipment, there's a version of the app that'll be made available to the patient to log that they've received it. And in good condition, do they need to return and so on. But the real important aspect of this to the patient is something that they'll never see. There will always be a product available for them when they come into a site. It's one of the things UCLA was most focused on. Is the product available? Is it within expiry? Are we going to schedule a patient? They have the ability to check and see the exact status of the exact dose that they'll be giving to a patient prior to the patient coming in. And it's one of the things they use most often. Ben can tell you in one particular example, they were checking up to 40 to 50 times the status of a product before they dispensed it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we saw them peak at 99 times. The UCLA staff were checking on an individual item. But again, what you're talking about is a patient that is at risk of death if they don't get the right item. They're coming in. It's a massive infusion process in the back of their neck. And so they want to make sure they get it right. Everything's lined up.
We'll go to the next slide, Greg. Some of the other value segments that we've been looking at, right? The administration component of site-to-site shipments. So sponsors have better insight into shipping inventories. If we had to move product from one clinical study site to another, we have the ability to do that, and with the ability to track the data involved in that and reducing the product waste, loss, and overstock. If you think about how do you close out that study, the sites are unable to associate study lock with the study until it's too late for return, for inventories and audits. The application allows you to quickly close out the inventory. We're working on destruction notifications for the next pilot. We're also working on a number of other components to make sure that the site has as minimal burden as possible related to the use of the application.
Yep.
So
this last slide, and this is our last slide. At the beginning of the pilot, we did the data science behind the entire product. All of KitChain was designed to have certain capabilities. We sat down with the team, and again, this was Pfizer and Biogen and GSK, Merck. BMS was still present at that time, and there were a number of others, plus Allmec and us and a few others. And one of the things that we've started to focus on was, okay, we've built all of this data science around the problem. What do we have the capability to solve now based off of the data that we have available, the flows that we've built so far? And this was the answer. A great deal around logistics. Inventory tracking, we measured separately from logistics for a few reasons, not the least of which is different audience. Clinical site operations, whether it be dispensing or accountability or trial closeout, which we started to talk about just a few moments ago. A lot around quality. Mike happens to be one of our quality guys, so we can talk about that in great depth if we choose to. Import-export capabilities. This was actually one of the first things that we built as a capability, because one of the sponsors that was involved really wanted to focus around how they could improve their logistics around intercompany shipments, how they could better understand what was going on and how they could better negotiate contracts with shippers and logistics partners and so on. There's a fair amount of regulatory capability here that we didn't think about originally, but we realized we had all the data we needed for around recall and authenticity has become rather an important aspect of the commercial side of what KitChain can do. And auditing. Because we're a real-time record, auditing becomes much easier to do. Patient compliance, because we have this direct-to-patient capability, we also have a better understanding of patient status. We can gather e-consent. We generally don't expect to because there are other capabilities that do that better. But for a small study, for a small vendor, it may be something that becomes important. We have the opportunity to gather SAEs because we're already gathering information from the patient when they get a direct-to-patient shipment. We have the capability to gather some basic information from them as well and kick off that process. We don't expect to close it out, but we know what to do when we receive that information. And some basic site things around future notification across sponsors. This can be used by more than one sponsor at a time. That was the basic design of it. Around inventory, we talked about basic inventory that can be provided. And the trial closeout one became very interesting because one of the reasons that, and I'll speak specifically to UCLA, one of the reasons that UCLA felt that they had so much inventory in their research pharmacies was because of all the stuff they couldn't return, that they were legally bound to keep, even expired product that they couldn't destroy. And local regulations in California that prevented a lot of the destruction that they needed to do. So suddenly they were in a position where the earlier we know about closeout and the inventory that goes along with that, the more likely we are to get a sponsor to take it back. And we built some processes in to help with that. So all of these became capable. Not all of these have been built, but the data science behind these is done, and that allows us to build them quickly. And at no point are we going to be in a position to say, no, we can't do that because of the following things. We know we can do these. There are probably others we haven't considered, but these we have the data to support. So I think that brings us to questions. But we have a little bit of spare time. Please.
Hopefully it's not an inappropriate question. Phil Heifetz, I'm with Innovative Supply Solutions.
Sure.
Is there a business model attached to this?
There is.
Okay, and how would that work?
For the most part, the sponsors are driving this. We do offer it out as a capability out of IQVIA as well, though we don't expect that to be the primary way in which it gets sold. Primarily, we expect the sponsors are going to be interested, largely right now around the ability to reduce burden at the sites, but also the ability to better control complex studies. We have one that we're considering for this right now, where supplies are coming from 7 different sources into one site. Rather than shipping them through warehouse, we'll use this to do the controls around that. So this becomes a possibility. But the commercial model largely is sponsors paying for it. There's generally, and Ben can probably speak to this better than I can, but the general focus is a per trial fee associated with number of patients and number of sites, and a setup fee that goes along with that. Because the truth is most of the expenses associated with it are really around setup and shutdown. And the transactions in between are, there's a cost associated with it, but they're less burdensome. Am I making sense to you?
Yeah, is there a problem if you have a depot, you have somebody who is in supply chain
That doesn't participate. Yeah, it would. We're collecting it throughout the supply chain. In fact, that's really the point. What we are interested in is from point A, wherever that may be. It could be at the manufacturing location, or it could be at a depot. But from that point forward in the supply chain, we're tracking.
We have time for quite a few questions, so we'll go ahead and continue.
Yeah, just adding to Greg's point, I think that one of the benefits that sponsors are looking for is reduced comparator cost. And so when they've got a study with a very high comparator cost and you're seeing some monster, bills in these phase 3s, the idea if they can cut back just, one inventory turn, that would be a big, big savings. Then the related question, obviously there's going to be stakeholders that are not technologically sophisticated and are averse to BYOD kind of issues. And so the goal in those cases is to provide an email fallback as often as possible so that, everybody pretty much has access to email. And the idea is that they can email out of a phone, even if it's a BYOD averse place or they've got their desktop. The challenge is less where folks are using machine to machine and desktop, but where they're going to need to scan something. But again, which is what Mike Keach was talking about. The fallback there is to do a manual entry. That's not the desired thing, but when you prompt for a study, you only have to enter a couple of digits to sort of cover it if it's already set up to ingest that particular study. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm going to direct the first question to Imran. So work so far has been more focused on studies in the US, and like your understanding of how you see the challenges and the benefits of moving internationally.
Yeah, I think the benefits are going to be consistent with, what I mentioned in my talk earlier about, that visibility of the data and how we bring about it. So, we definitely need to head in that direction. The challenges are still there. I was asked in one of the, follow-up questions about, kind of the barcoding and some of the challenges we have with, expiry dates and how that gets, viewed, especially with new guidance about, basically the expiry needing to be printed, everywhere and anywhere. And so we have those type of challenges that are real, but it doesn't mean that we can't do, we can't work with sort of like, kind of a solution or two solutions in parallel. If I phrase that correctly, meaning that, you would still have your printed information, your printed content, for example, but in parallel, you could still supplement that with barcode. And we all know that, the barcode, in addition to giving you that point-to-point visibility, it can also lead to other, sort of promising technologies with e-labels and things like that. Maybe we can talk about that another day. But these are still concerns that, we're still battling, in all the different, major regions and major, health authorities. So, that probably reinforces the fact of, why we focused more on US, at least from, our perspective first, because we feel like we just have a little bit of better, control, so to speak, in terms of, launching a pilot. So the challenges are still going to be there. We have to be really, we have to challenge ourselves to think of what can we do in parallel with current regulations that can allow for that. And we haven't even gotten into, talks about, privacy and controlling the data and things like that too, that come into play here.
Thanks. And I'm going to redirect to Greg. I know Greg's done some work on studies in Switzerland and other places where you were managing a lot of different hardware assets and different people with different skill sets. Greg, you have any thoughts on this?
I think the advantage, I think I've got one. No, they're not. I think the advantages are pretty straightforward. The more complex a study is, the more difficult to track all of this is. And generally, when we're dealing with international studies, we're dealing with a minimum of 5 countries or more. So we end up with complex problems to solve, and the tracking becomes much easier when you have a set of tools behind it. The other thing I would add to that is we did consider, even early in the evolution of the structure, what that might look like, and built the majority of the application around GDPR as a model. So the privacy structures, the basic approaches are there. What isn't there is how do we make sure that we only host European data in Europe and so on. But that becomes relatively straightforward. And I said I wouldn't say blockchain again, but I will. That's one of the things that allows us to deal with that pretty effectively, is because we have characteristics of the users, because we have an understanding of what data they're dealing with. We know where they are and where that data is regulated.
And then redirecting to Mr. Keach, you're our compliance guru. As you move out internationally and looking at these multi-country studies, what are the specific compliance issues that you see us having to tackle?
I think for me, from a quality perspective, just understanding inventory status, product release, how do you deal with retention samples? How do you deal with goods that may be damaged in transit, and such that you have the ability to quarantine that not just physically, but also within the application itself. And so those are some of the important parts about, quality, and making sure that you've got the right resources on site that can do the product release through the application itself.
Great. And then final question for Imran on that front. Which country are you most excited to bring KitChain to?
Oh, it's a loaded question. TBD. I don't know if I have necessarily we'd certainly, with after our first pilot coming to the US, I think there makes a lot of sense to explore the EU and some parallels that can be drawn there. At the same time, when I think about other regions like Japan in particular, we know that Japan sort of has their unique set of ways of operating, in terms of how they even interact and behave with the PIs in a lot of ways is different. But what they're really good about is, tracking and documentation and things like that. So to me, that kind of presents an interesting opportunity where, okay, well, if it's already fairly robust from a paper-driven perspective, inserting a tool such as, the KitChain application could be of significant value in an ecosystem like that. And just to add one more thing, Ben, is just to kind of expand on, what Mike was saying, is that, let's take a look at Brexit as an example, right? We've all had so many challenges with, managing releases, understanding, the complexities of, sending from, one depot that's based in, maybe, Ireland, or another that's based in Germany, et cetera. And these type of regulations, like if there's like another, hard to say if Brexit impact is really done. I don't think it is, but there could be other similar regulatory changes in the environment. And I think a lot of that's going to come back to, from a supply chain perspective, certainly, like, do we have good optics on managing that? And how do we get visibility of knowing that we need to transfer supplies from one depot to the next depot, and how that's going to work? So it's a really good example of where benefits could be.
Got it. And I think based on this week's newspapers, that the redrawing of European maps is probably not done yet. But if we could redirect to Greg, IQVIA is very engaged in this personalized medicine space. You guys have widely publicized partnerships with Be the Match and California Institute of Regenerative Medicine. What are the special challenges for personalized medicine? And again, what do you think the benefits are of tackling that area?
And as we start to talk about personalized medicine, especially cell and gene therapies, the notion of where a sample comes from, where it's processed, and where the patient is become critical, and matching them becomes critical. Mismatching generally means impending death, to be simple. The likelihood of survival of getting the wrong product is, it's a roll of the dice, quite honestly. So anything that we can do to certify that, to make that not happen, becomes very important. The immutability of these records, the ability to track in real time, the ability to have absolute certainty that when a patient gives us a donation, when it's brought to a processing center, and when it's brought back to that patient or a different patient, whichever one is appropriate in the situation, we get the right match. We know that we're doing it right. And that's where we've started to partner with some of these partnerships that we've talked about, is bringing that together under one umbrella. How do you bring that together in a clear way? And one of the advantages of doing that through KitChain versus doing that with an integrated tool is, well, I've already said it, it doesn't have to be integrated. Therefore, they have choices on what tools they apply to the problem, and they bring what is most appropriate to a particular cell and gene solution. So we have the opportunity to stitch together the right things in the right places. And that's really where it becomes most important, is bringing the right solution to a patient in real time.
And again, redirecting to Mike, what are your thoughts on that issue?
I think one of the biggest challenges may be that we haven't really even broached is the data privacy component of it. You know, as California, New York, and Virginia, and others here in the US put in data privacy standards. If you look at GDPR and other countries that are using that as the model, Brazil is just in the process of doing their data privacy and updating that. China approved their PIPL privacy protocols in November of this year. So I think as we think about personalized medicine and we think about the ability to use this technology from patient in the cell and gene therapy space, we need to be very careful about the data privacy components of that. Even if we don't have patient data in there, we'll have to address that issue at some point in time.
And Imran, on the personalized medicine side, how big an issue is that for your team over the next 5 years? Do you see more and more studies that are going to be following that path? And what do you think the big push is going to be within your four walls?
Yeah, I mean, you know, absolutely. It will continue to be a focus. You know, I think as Greg mentioned, like certainly, you know, the more we, the deeper we go into, you know, gene therapy, for example. But outside of that too, you know, when you think about wearables in particular, and, you know, some of the really good information that we're able to potentially tap into from a digital health perspective is really, I mean, you know, like it's really exciting for sure, but, you know, there's always going to be questions around, as Mike just mentioned, around data privacy and how we aggregate that data, you know, where we feed it into. So for sure, for, you know, us at Biogen, you know, digital health is definitely one of our, you know, pillars moving forward that we want to focus on. And it's going to continue to be, you know, a growing conversation and a more, you know, a more challenging conversation. The more we get into it, right, the deeper we're going to, you know, find out nuances, whether it's, you know, one country interpreting a set of rules in one way versus another. So I don't think it's going to get any easier. That's for sure. So it's probably not a helpful response, but I think it's a very realistic one.
No, I get it. And so again, redirecting to Greg, I mean, the timescales and the cadence for this personalized medicine are a lot different. On one hand, many of these things are only available for a couple of days before they go bad. And on the back end of the study, you're looking at maybe a 25-year, you know, view of what happens to the patient. So as you think about these cadences, how does this sort of affect the overall view of the study?
I think the basics of it are actually pretty simple. The better organized we are, the more quickly we're able to respond. When we have a product that essentially is a product that expires within a couple of days, we don't have room for a lot of mistakes. If it's shipped to the wrong place, if it's shipped in the wrong way, if it's shipped inappropriately, we end up with a product that needs to be remanufactured. And because in most cell and gene therapies, especially in clinical trials, we're dealing with patients who are deathly ill. They don't have a lot of time to have another sample drawn and remanufactured and sent back, because that often is a 2-week sort of problem between scheduling and manufacturing processes and so on. So we don't have a lot of room for error. And as a result, doing it the right time and knowing we did it the right time becomes critically important.
And so, Mike, if you think about on the other side, that 25-year look back that is so amazingly long, from a perspective of your view, how do you manage those sorts of things in an intelligent way?
I think in terms of managing that in an intelligent way, it's the data repository that you end up keeping. It's the security of that information that you're using and being able to look back sort of the where used question, right? So how does that inventory, where was the manufacturing process? Who did it end up in? What was the timing for that? And then just maintaining that history throughout the duration of the patient's life. So.
Yeah, I think the patient's likely to outlast their own doctor's care, and we're talking about 25 years. Marianne, are we able to take any questions from the audience during this session? And should we open it up?
We certainly can, and I'm watching the chat box as well. We haven't had any questions from the remote audience yet, but I'll remind verbally now, please submit your questions. Let your fingers do the talking. Questions for here in the audience? I have a question when you're talking about longevity in 25 years. As we all know and are experiencing, technology evolves, and you're talking about the data. How are you preserving that data in such a way that 25 years from now, people will still have access to that data?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. Clearly, when you're talking about 25 years, you're outliving a lot of your systems. Solid state drives only last, 8 or 9 years at this point. And so you want to be able to move these things to a place where they're going to be safe. I know our friends at Pfizer maintained an entire skyscraper full of paper to sort of be available when they get a regulatory request. And hopefully we won't have to fall back to that. But being organized and maintaining your CFR compliance is part of the whole story. And that's something that everybody's going to have to dial into together. Greg?
I think there are a couple of things to speak to there. And I'll use our cell and gene therapies as an example. Well, not ours, but our clients. When we're going through trial, we'll use kit chain, we'll use other similar things. That data, as a patient comes to the end of the trial, gets transitioned into a series of registry capabilities that we have, as well as into a series of analytical capabilities that we have. Those registries are intended to last that 25 years. So all of that data is collected in a single place and is readable in a variety of formats, but most importantly is defined. And we define what we'll keep, what we won't keep, and for how long. So all of that becomes regulatory concern, but it becomes a definable problem that we can work through. And the definable set of data is what we preserve for that longer period of time. And that's true whether the patient remains in contact with us or not. Sometimes it becomes difficult to keep contact with a patient. Sometimes a patient decides that they've given us enough information and they're going to discontinue. And of course, some patients pass away from other reasons. 25 years is a long time. And we don't always know about it. So that may be an unknown end from our perspective. But all of that gets collected in definable ways. And therefore, we have a fighting chance of keeping it for that long period of time. No?
Imran, do you have any comment on data longevity, I guess, and technology?
Yeah, I mean, if only I had a crystal ball. But I think Greg's point about, how, every sponsor, every organization, vendor partner, et cetera, are going to have a set of rules around their data retention. How that is going to evolve over time, and the systems that will evolve over time alongside of it in terms of the systems that collect that data is TBD. But I think that as long as we're able to manage it from a data governance perspective, we should be able to build in processes that help control it.
I'll add one more aspect to this. I mentioned that we have registries that we support to drive this. Very often, we don't own those ourselves. Very often, we have them sponsored through a patient organization of some sort. I'll use one of our examples, Muscular Dystrophy Association. They are the face for a lot of the data that we gather within that indication. They are the face of the registry as well. We host it on their behalf, but in the end, they have responsibility for long-term use of that data. There's a lot of advantages in that. One of them is the longevity. They will be around quite some time. They have interest in the disease and interest in tracking, and they have interest in making sure that that data is usable in appropriate ways. And we work with them to make that happen. But in the end, that becomes part of the longevity as well. They have incentive, and they have incentive to do that in appropriate ways over very long periods of time.
And I think this is a topic that's become more and more important. Obviously, the public has become much more aware of the value of their data and the potential misuse of their data by either bad actors or Facebook or whomever. And I think we're seeing a real push on the part of folks to get a little bit more control over their identity and their data. We're seeing more tools that fall underneath what we call the Web3 grouping, where you're talking about verifiable credentials and stuff, where you can control your consent, control your ability to reconsent, and control your ability to unplug completely from the systems that you feel aren't serving your needs anymore. And I think that's going to be an important part of the whole picture. I think we've got time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Sean Sigmund with Informed DNA. We do some applied genetics expertise, but more interested in the question around the patient's, the patient rights to this data and the ability for that patient to decide to just delete and get rid of it if it's no longer available, and remove that from the sponsor's ownership. And then it's just, as you build these databases, you come out of trials, whether it's IQVIA or the sponsor or the hospital system, whomever it is who has that data record, how do you share it, like with, say, a payer, for example, that may actually, try to help in terms of managing that patient's care moving forward in a cohesive way? Maybe the payer is not the best example, but some other caregiver down the road that doesn't live in that town or that city or whatever, how do they gain access to it, and how does that become shareable?
Yeah, Sean, that's a great series of questions that we'll have to unpack. But I would say that, there's going to be some firewalls between a study and a payer for sure. But that being said, I think that, what we're looking at, as I said, is this pattern of consent and reconsent that's going to be very fine-grained going forward. And as Greg said, I think the patient advocacy groups are going to play a very important role in the way that these things are managed, particularly in those domains where you have minors and their consent. I think that's going to be a super big challenge for all of us to be aware of, because again, perhaps the parental consent was given 20 years later. Obviously, the child has aged out, and we've got to be able to reconsent and manage that process. There's a lot to it. I'm going to ask Mike to talk about that.
I think, again, from a consent perspective, it's one of the most important components of what we do at IQVIA. It's one of the offerings that we have, but more important than what we do in that space is the ability for the end user, the patient, to be able to understand where their data is being used. And I think, to Greg's point, muscular dystrophy, ALS, others, it comes back to the registry, and the burden is really on that group, in my mind, to manage that consent process, the e-consent, and the ability to remove yourself from that process.
In a sense, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are some complex aspects to this, and every registry has a different set of questions that goes around that. I'll give an example. Ben mentioned that we do a lot of work with Be the Match and the National Marrow Donation Program. One of the things we work with them on is collection of data from hospital. And they have a series of tiers that they have to gather that data in. And those tiers are based largely on consent because there's a certain set of data that needs to be gathered by law. There's a certain set of data for particular studies that can be gathered on top of that. And there's more data still that can be gathered based on the hospital and their core set of services, and in some cases, trials that they're running as well. And each one of those is separately consented. And one, of course, that which has to be gathered by law is depersonalized and not consented. They're notified, they do a form of consent, but it's not optional, if I put it that way. So each of those is managed a little bit differently. And as a result, you have a complex set of equations as to how that data can be used and where and why and when. And in that case, NMDP is not the only holder of that data. Of course, their hospital is as well. So they have a separate set of consents around that. So all of these get to be very complicated very quickly. But we have mechanisms by which we can manage that. And those mechanisms include some of what you talked about. The ability to consent now and change your mind later, these sorts of things. So you have the opportunity to be removed from registries at some point in time. And we also try and build some incentives into that. So in some of our registries, for instance, we'll make sure that they know where their data has been used and how and what research studies and outcomes it may have contributed to. So all of that requires us to be able to track in good detail their data and what's been done with it.
Well, we need to wrap up now because next station is going to be leaving the track. So Ben, very quickly, wrap up.
Thanks very much, Marianne. I want to thank Michael Keach and Greg Plant from IQVIA, and a special thanks to Imran Shakur from Biogen, who's going to be heading out to Pakistan soon, and we will hopefully a little warmer there, I'm not sure. But thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. And we're going to turn the forum over to Cheryl Cole from ALMAC. ALMAC's been a valuable partner to all of us on this journey, but she's going to talk specifically about the technology playbook that they're thinking about and what she's focused on in the supply chain. And I appreciate the time that she's taken to share all this with us.